The sun had begun its slow descent beyond the jagged cliffs, casting streaks of crimson and gold across the wide western sky. Shadows stretched long over the river valley, and the air was cool with the crisp scent of pine and wild sage. The rancher, weary from a long day of labor, guided his horse along the worn trail by the riverbank. His shirt clung to his back with the sweat of hours under the relentless sun, and his hands bore the rough calluses of rope and leather. It had been another day of mending fences, checking cattle, and working the land that demanded everything from him, but gave just enough in return to keep him going. As he tugged gently on the reins, preparing to cross a shallow bend in the river before heading home, a sound rose above the constant murmur of the water. It wasn't the cry of a bird nor the wind through the trees. It was sharp, desperate, a cry that sliced through the quiet evening. His horse stopped, ears pricked forward, sensing danger. The rancher froze, his pulse quickening. He strained to listen, and then it came again, clearer this time, a human voice choked with panic. His gaze swept the water, searching for movement, and then he saw her. At first he thought it was some illusion of the fading light, a shape formed by foam and shadow. But no, it was real, a woman struggling in the heart of the river. The current had her in its grip, dragging her toward the jagged rocks downstream. She was massive, far taller and broader than any woman he had ever seen. Her long black hair whipped across her face, soaked and heavy, and her arms thrashed against the water's pull. She was fighting with every ounce of strength she had, but the river was relentless, surging with the force of the mountain snowmelt. The rancher's breath caught. The stories of the Apache had always lingered on the edge of his life, whispered in town, half warnings, half legends. He had never been this close to one of them, and never under circumstances like this. He could have turned away, pretended he hadn't heard, left her to the mercy of the river. It would have been the safer choice, perhaps even the wiser one. But something inside him, a part of himself he didn't fully understand, wouldn't let him. Without thinking further, he swung down from his horse, boots crunching into the gravel. The river roared in his ears as he scrambled down the bank. The water was swift, a dark ribbon of power, and he knew the risk he was taking. One misstep and he could be swept under too. But the cry of the woman rose again, broken and strangled, and that was enough. He plunged into the icy torrent. The cold hit him like a hammer, knocking the air from his lungs. The water clawed at him, dragging him downstream, but he dug his boots into the stones beneath and pushed forward, step by step. His hands reached out, slicing through the spray as he waded deeper. The woman's head bobbed above the surface, then vanished, then rose again. She was strong, he could see that, but exhaustion had already begun to drag her movements into something sluggish, almost helpless. "Hold on," he shouted, though he doubted she could hear over the thunder of the current. His arms ached as he pushed forward, the water rising to his chest. The rocks under his feet shifted treacherously, slick with moss. He stumbled once, nearly losing his balance, and for a heart-stopping moment the river pulled at him like a giant's hand. But he gritted his teeth, forced his legs steady, and kept going. Closer, just a little closer. At last he reached her. Her eyes snapped open as he grasped her arm, and in that instant he felt her raw power. Her muscles tensed like coiled steel, and for a second he thought she might strike him instead of accept his help. But then she sagged, too drained to resist, and he tightened his grip, hauling her toward him. Her weight nearly pulled him under, but he wrapped an arm across her chest, holding her head above water as he turned back toward the bank. The return was worse. Each step was a battle, the river raging at him for daring to steal its prize. His breath came in ragged gasps, his legs quivering with strain. His boots slipped, his knees buckled, but he kept dragging, kept fighting, because letting go wasn't an option anymore. The woman coughed and sputtered, her body heavy against his, and he knew if he faltered even once, both of them would be swallowed whole. Finally, his boots found shallower ground. With a roar of effort, he heaved her forward, stumbling onto the bank. They collapsed together on the wet grass, both gasping for air, their chests heaving as if the world itself had tried to drown them. For a long moment, neither moved. The rancher lay on his back, staring up at the sky, feeling the fire in his lungs and the ache in his limbs. Beside him, the woman coughed violently, water spilling from her lips, each sound raw and guttural. When she finally rolled onto her side, he got his first real look at her. She was unlike any woman he had ever seen, towering over him even now, her body carved with strength, her features fierce and striking. Her dark eyes, framed by wet lashes, burned with something that was not mere gratitude. It was fire, pride, and a hint of anger, all tangled together. The rancher opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. What could he say? He had saved her life, but he had no idea what that meant in her world. She sat up slowly, water streaming from her long hair, her breath still uneven. For a heartbeat, her gaze lingered on him, as though she were weighing him, measuring him not just as a man but as a force of fate. Then, without a word, she pushed herself to her feet. Her tall frame cast a long shadow in the dying light. She looked down at him once more, eyes unreadable, and then turned. The rancher blinked, stunned, as she walked away. She moved with surprising strength for someone who had nearly drowned, slipping into the forest beyond the riverbank. Within moments, she was gone, swallowed by the trees as if she had never been there at all. Only the wet grass and the chill on his skin remained to prove it had happened. He sat there for a long time, the sounds of the evening slowly returning, the call of a night bird, the rustle of leaves, the whisper of the water. His horse waited patiently upstream, head lowered to graze. But the rancher could not shake what he had seen, what he had felt. That cry for help, the weight of her body in his arms, the fire in her eyes as she looked at him for that one fleeting second. It was as if the river had not only tried to drown them but had bound them together in some unseen way. As the last of the sunlight bled from the horizon, the rancher finally rose, his body still trembling with exhaustion. He retrieved his horse, mounted, and turned toward home. But though his body traveled back to the ranch, his thoughts stayed by the river, replaying the moment over and over. He didn't know who she was beyond being Apache, didn't know why she had been there or what her disappearance into the woods might mean. But deep in his gut, he knew this was not the end. Saving her was only the beginning, and whatever path had opened that evening, he would soon find himself walking it, whether he wished to or not. The rancher did not sleep that night. He lay on his narrow bed, staring up at the ceiling of the cabin, listening to the creak of the timbers and the distant call of coyotes. His body begged for rest after the battle with the river, but his mind refused to surrender. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, the wild strength of her eyes, the sharp lines of her cheekbones, the water streaming down her shoulders as she rose and vanished into the forest. He had rescued men before, pulled fellow cowhands from stampedes, and once even dragged a neighbor out of a well when the man had fallen in. But none of those moments had haunted him like this. Those rescues had ended with handshakes, laughter, and gratitude. This one ended in silence, in a woman's shadow melting into the trees, leaving him with more questions than answers. Who was she? Why had she been in the river alone, struggling as if caught in some invisible war? And most troubling of all, what would it mean for him now? He had grown up hearing stories about the Apache, their fearsome raids, their defiance against the encroaching settlers, their unbending pride. Some men in town spoke of them with hatred, others with fear, a few with grudging respect. But none of those stories had ever described a moment like this, an outsider pulling one of their own from death's grip. He wondered if the Apache saw such an act as interference, an insult, or perhaps something far more complicated. The longer he thought about it, the heavier the weight pressed on his chest. He had acted on instinct, not on reason. There had been no time to consider what would follow, and now the unknown stretched before him like a canyon, wide and shadowed. Yet beneath the unease, there was something else stirring inside him. A sense that his life had just been nudged, perhaps shoved, into a current he could no longer control. He had not chosen this path, but it had chosen him. By the time the pale light of dawn crept through his window, he was already dressed and outside, the chill morning air biting at his skin. He saddled his horse with movements that were sharp, almost restless, and rode back toward the river. The world was still, save for the whisper of the wind through the cottonwoods and the steady murmur of water. His horse's hooves sank into the damp earth as he retraced his steps to the place where he had pulled her from the current. The grass was flattened still, bearing the memory of their bodies sprawled there, but beyond that there was no sign of her passing. He dismounted, crouching low, brushing his fingers over the ground as though it might tell him something. He half expected to find footprints, some trace of where she had gone, but the earth gave him nothing. The forest loomed silent on the far bank, its dark branches swaying like sentinels. He felt eyes on him, though he could not see them. That sense of being watched, of being weighed and measured, prickled across his skin. He stood and scanned the tree line. "I didn't mean no harm," he muttered, though the words seemed foolish, spoken to the emptiness. His voice sounded small against the vastness of the woods. He almost hoped she might emerge again, even if only to confront him. But the forest offered no reply. For a long time he lingered there, the sound of the water filling his ears, the image of her clinging to him replaying in his mind like a brand he could not rub out. Finally, he mounted up again and turned toward home, but the tension in his gut didn't ease. He knew better than most how the land carried whispers. If she had told her people what had happened, then by now they would know of him. And if they knew, then the question became not if they would come, but when that afternoon he tried to work, repairing a gate, checking the herd, doing the 1,000 small chores that kept the ranch alive. But his hands shook more than once. Every creak of the windmill, every rustle of brush sent his eyes darting to the horizon. He imagined riders cresting the ridges, arrows nocked, rifles glinting in the sun. And yet alongside the fear there was another image he could not escape. Her gaze before she left, burning with something more than anger, more than pride. It had been a look that carried weight, like the gaze of someone who had seen deeper into him than he had ever allowed. When dusk fell, he found himself walking back down to the river. The sky blazed orange, the water catching the last of the sun like melted copper. He sat on a rock near the bank, his hat in his hands, staring at the current. He had been raised to believe in cause and effect, in the simple logic of work. Mend a fence and it holds. Plant a seed and it grows. Save a life and it changes something. But this was different. It felt less like cause and effect and more like destiny. The sound of a branch snapping pulled him from his thoughts. His head whipped around, heart hammering. The forest behind him stood still, yet the weight of unseen eyes pressed heavier than before. He rose slowly, scanning the shadows, but again, nothing revealed itself. It was worse than confrontation. It was anticipation, like the air before a storm. He left the river reluctantly, his nerves stretched thin, and returned once more to his cabin. That night was no easier than the one before. His dreams were full of water, of strong hands slipping from his grasp, of voices he couldn't understand calling from the trees. When he woke, drenched in sweat, he swore he could still hear them whispering. By the third morning, the tension had woven itself into every part of him. He worked as always, but his eyes never stopped scanning the horizon. He knew the Apache were watching. He could feel it. His rescue of the woman had bound him to something far larger than himself, something he couldn't yet name. He told himself he was ready for whatever came, but the truth was, he didn't know if a man could ever truly be ready. As the sun climbed high, heat rippling off the earth, the silence finally broke. A low sound like distant thunder rolled across the land. He looked up, squinting into the glare, and his stomach dropped. On the ridge above the valley, silhouettes appeared, riders, many of them, moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm. His breath caught, his pulse quickened. He had been waiting for this moment since the river, and now it had come. The figures grew clearer as they descended, each mounted on a strong, lean horse, their long hair streaming behind them, weapons glinting faintly in the sun. At their head rode a man larger than the rest, his presence unmistakable even at a distance. The rancher's mouth went dry as he recognized the same strength, the same bearing he had glimpsed in the woman. He had no doubt. This was her blood, her kin, and they had come with purpose. He swallowed hard, straightened his back, and set his hat firmly on his head. Whatever was about to unfold had begun that night in the river, and there was no turning from it now. The midday sun burned hot against the rancher's neck as he stood rooted in the dirt, his eyes fixed on the ridge. The sound of hooves was no longer distant thunder. It was a steady drumbeat rolling through the earth, each beat hammering into his chest. Dust rose in thin columns around the riders as they descended, their figures sharp against the bright horizon. He counted them unconsciously, 6, then 10, then more until he lost track. A dozen at least, maybe more, all mounted on lean, powerful horses that moved as if they were an extension of their riders. Their dark hair streamed with the wind, and the glint of polished metal flashed from lances, rifles, and ornaments of silver and turquoise. At the front rode a man unlike any he had ever seen. Even at a distance, the chief's presence commanded the world around him. He sat tall in the saddle, his back straight as if carved from oak, his shoulders broad beneath a garment fringed with beads and eagle feathers. His face was lined with the kind of years that carved wisdom and sorrow in equal measure, but his eyes burned bright and fierce, catching the light like shards of flint. The rancher did not need an introduction. He knew instinctively this was the father of the woman he had pulled from the river. Blood recognized blood, and he saw her features reflected in him, the strength, the fire, the unshakable pride. The riders fanned out as they reached the valley floor, forming a crescent around him. Their horses snorted, stamping the ground, restless but controlled. The air itself seemed to tighten, holding its breath. The rancher's hand hovered near his belt, not for his revolver but for the reassurance of something solid, something familiar. But he knew drawing a weapon would be suicide. These men had not come here blindly, and every one of them looked ready to unleash a storm if he made the wrong move. The chief dismounted with a deliberate grace, his tall frame unfolding like a mountain rising from the earth. He walked forward, boots striking the dirt in heavy echoing steps. The silence was deafening, broken only by the creak of leather and the distant rush of the river. Each stride carried the weight of command, as though the land itself bent to his authority. When he stopped a few paces away, the rancher could feel the force of his presence like heat from a fire. The chief's eyes bore into him, and for a long moment, nothing was said. The rancher felt as if his very soul was being measured, every weakness and strength laid bare. His mouth was dry, his heart beat a relentless pounding in his ears. He forced himself to stand tall, shoulders squared, though inside he fought the urge to lower his gaze like a boy caught in mischief. He had faced angry men before, even stared down the barrel of a gun in saloons and disputes over land. But this was something different. This was judgment that carried more than life or death. It carried legacy, honor, the weight of an entire people. Finally, the chief spoke, his voice low and resonant, as if the earth itself lent him its power. The words were Apache, sharp and rhythmic, flowing like a river the rancher couldn't understand. For a moment, confusion tightened his chest. But then in slow, careful English, the chief repeated, his accent thick but his intent unmistakable. "You pulled my daughter from the river." The rancher swallowed hard. His voice felt clumsy in his throat, but he forced it out. "I did. She was drowning. I couldn't just ride on." The chief's expression didn't change. His dark eyes studied him, unblinking, and the silence stretched again, taut as a rope about to snap. Then the chief nodded once, a movement so subtle it might have been missed if not for the sharpness with which it broke the stillness. "You risked your life for her," the chief said. "You did not have to." "Oh." The chief tilted his head as though weighing the truth of that statement. Around them, the Apache riders remained silent, their eyes watchful, their bodies still but ready. The tension hung heavy in the air, but it no longer felt like the edge of violence. Instead, it was something more delicate, like a scale balancing between mistrust and respect. The chief's voice deepened, steady and powerful. "Among my people, courage is sacred. To risk your life for another, without promise of reward, is a gift given only by the brave. You are not Apache, but you acted as a warrior should. For that I cannot ignore you." The rancher let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The words were not praise exactly, but they carried weight all the same. He nodded slowly, respectful, unsure if speaking further would help or harm. And then the forest stirred. From behind the chief, the woman emerged. She stepped into the open, her tall frame rising above the riders who parted for her without a word. Her presence was magnetic, commanding, even more so than when he had pulled her from the river. Dressed now in dry clothing, fringed leather that clung to her powerful form, she looked every bit a warrior's daughter. Her long black hair framed her face, and her eyes, those fierce burning eyes, locked onto his. The rancher's breath caught. She moved forward with the quiet grace of someone used to carrying both strength and expectation. When she stood beside her father, her gaze didn't waver. It was softer than before, but it still carried the fire he remembered. The chief glanced at her, then back at the rancher. "This is my daughter. She owes her life to you, and I, as her father and as leader of my people, owe you recognition." The word struck him like a hammer. Recognition. It wasn't just thanks, it was a statement, a promise that what had been done would not be forgotten. The rancher shifted his weight, unsure how to respond, feeling the heat of so many eyes upon him. He finally gave a small nod, his voice quiet but steady. "I didn't do it for reward. I just couldn't let her drown." The chief studied him for a long moment, then nodded once more. His gaze softened, and the faintest glimmer of respect flickered there. "You speak truth," he said, "and truth is more valuable than silver." The riders behind him murmured low, their voices carrying approval. The chief raised his hand, and silence returned instantly. His presence commanded not only men, but the very air around them. The rancher felt the weight of the moment pressing in from all sides. He knew something was about to be given or taken, some decision made that would alter everything that followed. He braced himself, steadying his breath, his eyes flicking once more to the woman beside her father. She still hadn't looked away, and in her gaze he saw something he couldn't yet name. Gratitude, perhaps, but more than that. A connection, fragile but unbreakable, forged in the river and carried now into the open. Whatever was coming next, he knew with certainty that the river had carried him into something far greater than himself.